Aaron, what's your understanding as to how quickly the rest of us will learn what's in this indictment?
It should come at any moment as soon as the proceeding is complete. And our best indication that it was underway is the release of these images, because the photographers that were allowed in to snap photos were only allowed while the judge was not on the bench. So as soon as those photographers were escorted out and were able to show us these pictures, that means the judge is on the bench and the proceeding by now well underway. All the former president has to do is enter his not guilty plea. There may be some housekeeping matters, another date set for a status conference or a motion schedule, and then the judge will formally conclude the proceeding. I'm also struck by one other element in this photo, David. Behind the officers, you would normally see spectators in that first row. I was told that those first row, even two, would be kept empty as something of a buffer between the spectators gallery and the former president, as yet another measure of security. So those members of the public and the press that were allowed in are in the back of the courtroom.
And perhaps, Aaron, you could speak to some of the irony here. As we can hear the helicopters hovering overhead, we hear the ambient noise there above you. But some of the irony here that it was Donald Trump's team, and we know this is a former president who had...
The presumption in New York courts, David, is always that cameras are not allowed. Occasionally, a judge will allow a video camera in for just a few moments to capture a few frames of video, but rarely are proceedings like this actually televised, certainly not live, and certainly not wall-to-wall like this. So it wasn't a surprise, but it was the former president's attorneys who said that putting cameras in that courtroom would create not only a circus-like atmosphere, but also would be an infringement on the former president's presumption of innocence. And yet, for all of the talk of circus, out here there are a few hundred protesters mingled in with the curiosity seekers, and the former president seems to have caused some of that circus-like atmosphere by lashing out at the prosecutors and the judge in the case.
It is now 2:50 here in the East, 10 minutes before 3 o'clock in the East, and the breaking headline at this hour, just in, the former president has pleaded not guilty to the indictment that has been presented in that courtroom, the 15th floor of criminal court in Lower Manhattan. It's our understanding that he planned on making this plea himself and not through his lawyers. And John Santucci, what have you learned?
David, I'm told by a source in the courtroom the former president entered a plea of not guilty. We understand that they are going through the indictment right now. I don't have a readout on that just yet. But as that visual showed, the source telling me the former president sitting there listening quite intently right now, David.
It's your understanding so far, John, that it was the president, the former president himself, who entered the plea?
That I do not have clarity on, David. I'm working on that. I will keep you updated.
We'll see if that bears out. That was an indication given earlier. And again, as John points out, this would be a very strong indication, Kate and Dan, that we're going to soon know what's in this indictment, the fact that he's pleaded not guilty.
Yeah, and look, it's going to take them a little time to go through the indictment. If it is, dozens of counts, although if it is redundant and it may sort of reflect exactly the same language in a lot of the counts, just a little bit of a different fact as to which record, et cetera. So we don't know exactly, how detailed or complicated the indictment is going to be. But yes, I would expect that we should be getting this very soon. They have it now. They've reviewed it. He's pled not guilty, and this is the time for them to release it. It's going to be released electronically, so there's no, it's not like they literally need to walk out of the courthouse to deliver it to somebody. They've got it there, and they just have to decide when to release it.
Dan, what do we see after this? I mean, take us through what the American public will see. They'll enter the plea. They'll leave the courthouse. They'll head back to Mar-a-Lago. The rest of us will start reporting out what's inside this indictment. But where does the case go from here? This is just the very beginning.
Yeah, this is going to take a while. I mean, the first thing is going to be, there are going to be motions, right? There are going to be efforts by the defense in particular to dismiss the case, to limit the charges. If there are felonies, to say the felonies should go away. There's going to be a whole list of arguments that the defense is going to make about why the indictment should fail.
Are we looking at months, more than a year here?
Oh, yeah. The entire process, I would expect, is going to take more than a year. But that is going to be largely in the hands of the defendant. That is largely in the hands of Donald Trump. Remember, there's a right to a speedy trial. if the defendant wants to move a case quickly, a defendant can move a case quickly. That's not really up to the prosecutor. Now, there are certain things that can happen that are beyond a defendant's control, new evidence, whatever it is. But typically, it is up to the defendant to decide how quickly do we move this forward to trial. I would expect that Donald Trump is going to want to wait, that there is going to be no rush on his part to move forward with this. I think there probably will be a rush to get out some of his motions, right? To say that this is a faulty indictment, that there shouldn't be any felonies here, that there's no crime committed, et cetera. That I think he's going to want out quickly. But when it comes to actually going to trial, I think we're probably well over a year away.
And that becomes part of the political calculation, obviously.
Right, yeah.
I think that's right. At least, I would say at least a year. And in terms of kind of the early responses by Trump's defense team, I think we'll learn a lot about their strategy through their sort of early responses. If they move to dismiss these charges on the basis that this is, as Tacopina has been sort of alluding to in interviews, that this is a political persecution, that this whole case is flawed for that reason, that I think injects some of the political rhetoric into this legal conversation. If instead they say things like the statute of limitations has already run, this was 7 years ago, probably that's a 5-year statute, they're going to have to figure out how to finesse that. The prosecutors they may do it by saying the statute was paused while Trump was out of New York, of course being the president in D.C. So there could be legal arguments, there could be more politically inflected arguments, there could be a combination. But I do think they're going to move quickly to try to shape the narrative that will give us some real clues about their larger strategy.
For people at home watching and they hear this notion of motion to dismiss, what are the chances of that happening?
It's unlikely, but there are some real arguments. Look, we haven't seen the indictment yet. We need to see exactly what it is to know how strong the arguments may not be. I think once Kate and I get a chance to actually review what exactly they're alleging, immediately we'll be able to think about, okay, what could they argue as a defense attorney to eliminate the charges? But if there are felony counts here, and it is in connection with falsification of business records, there is going to be an immediate and serious argument that the felony counts shouldn't apply. We're going to have to see what is it that the prosecution is arguing that allows the misdemeanor to rise to the level of a felony.
I have a million questions for you on that, but I'm going to wait until we see what's in
Okay.
the indictment.
Yeah.
Because this could go in a multitude of directions. I wanted to tell the viewers at home what they're looking at. Beneath me there on the screen, that's, I gather, Mark Burstein, that's the hallway there on the 15th floor. Yeah, these are the live pictures, and we will see the president one more time when he leaves the courtroom after they list the charges, the counts in this indictment. As Dan Abrams has been saying here, there's a good chance that many of these counts are very similar in nature. Again, we simply don't know. That is widespread speculation. Multiple outlets suggesting that will be the case today. We are eager to get the indictment. We should have it shortly thereafter. We do know that as you look at this, that the former president was given this indictment, but not long before he entered that courtroom. He was brought into the building. He was booked, fingerprinted, and as Aaron Katersky said, no handcuffs, no mugshot, even though mugshots really aren't used in New York State anyway. There had been many questions about whether or not that would happen with the former president.
Taking a year to get to trial. Just put that against the political calendar. About a year from the day before yesterday is going to be the Wisconsin primary, which would have followed probably enough primaries to clinch a Republican nominee. The Republican convention is about 15 and a half months from now. So if you have a trial that starts in roughly a year, depending on how it plays out, you could have a jury deliberating on the eve of a Republican convention. I mean, this is playing out against a political calendar, and it's not the only criminal case that will be.
Just extraordinary, John, when you think about it in those terms. It's also fascinating to watch this unfold, and I use that word carefully, when you think about the Republican opponents that he will face in this primary process. Obviously, Ron DeSantis hasn't declared, but very much looks and acts like a presidential candidate. But he, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, with the exception of the governor you interviewed in the recent days, Asa Hutchinson, everyone else, though, is rallying around the man they would like to beat for the nomination.
What he's done is he's forced his potential opponents and some of his actual opponents to come out and defend him on this case. Now, not everybody's going to do it. You mentioned Asa Hutchinson. I mean, we'll see what happens with Chris Christie, who was just on, with us. If he ends up running, he's also been quite calling this a serious case. But look, we see Republicans, by and large, coming to Donald Trump's defense. The only statement I've seen so far since he walked into that courtroom has been from the number 3 Republican in the House, and she has come out, Elise Stefanik, and she has attacked the judge, attacked this process, and put it directly in the context of the presidential campaign, saying that Donald Trump will defeat this the way he defeated the impeachments, the way he's defeated other investigations, and he will get elected president in 2024. That's the number 3 Republican in the House using this as an opportunity, not just to defend Donald Trump against these allegations, but also to put it in the context of the presidential campaign.
John Carl on the political implications and the race for the White House, which we cannot forget is well underway. I want to bring in John Santucci, who has, all right, so you've heard that from John Santucci. He's reporting 34 felony counts falsifying records. For those of us who aren't lawyers, what does that mean, Dan Abrams?
Well, that's what we expected, right? We expected that the charge was for falsifying the business records, and this relates to the hush money payments. This was that the hush money payments were categorized as legal fees. And Michael Cohen has made it clear, and whether you believe Michael Cohen or not, the prosecutors will say that they have other evidence that supports it, that this was a payment made to, I think prosecutors will argue, to help his campaign. We'll have to see exactly what the felony enhancement is for, but that the reason you can elevate it from a misdemeanor to a felony is by saying that the falsification of the business records was done in an effort to conceal another crime. And the question then becomes, what is the other crime that they were concealing? It's basically saying, if you're going to falsify business records, it makes it worse when you're falsifying the business records to try to hide another crime. And that's what rises it to the level of a felony.
And what we don't know at this point is what Alvin Bragg will argue is the other crime.
Right. We think it's going to be campaign related, but it could be something else. And Kate and I were talking about this, that it could actually be one of the uncharged crimes, right?
Right. So this could be a state campaign finance law. It could be something else. It could be still potentially a tax crime, right? Or some other kind of business offense. It doesn't sound like that from the sort of initial responses to this indictment, but we just don't know. But there needs to be something other than just the falsifying of business records, because standing alone, those are misdemeanors. And it sounds like this plea was entered in response to felony charges.
So initially, if I'm cutting through what you're saying, initially it would seem Alvin Bragg is trying to connect the falsification of these records to impacting a campaign.
In an effort, right, potentially that the falsification of the business records was done so that he could help his campaign.
Exactly.
That and in an improper and illegal way.
And that's a test. That's a real test for a prosecutor.
And it's tough. We've seen other cases. These campaign finance cases are not easy to win. We saw this in the case of John Edwards. It was a different case, different fact pattern, but in that case, John Edwards had paid, a woman had been paid off on behalf of John Edwards, and the claim there was that that was effectively a campaign donation. And John Edwards went to trial, and the jury hung on most of the counts, and they didn't bring the case again because it's too hard to prove that it's just about impacting the campaign as opposed to paying hush money to prevent either your wife or others from finding out about it.
And since we know how difficult it is, I want to bring in Terry Moran on this, because Alvin Bragg certainly knows that in that previous case, which isn't exactly the same thing, it was difficult, it was thrown out, and so to move forward, some in the legal world are speculating that Alvin Bragg is more convinced given what he has here.
He is, or maybe he thinks he's going to have a friendlier jury. In the John Edwards case, Edwards' lawyers famously stood before the jury and said John Edwards has committed many sins, but no crimes. And that could be Donald Trump's defense as well, because in order to prove if, in fact, these misdemeanor counts of falsifying business records, in order to get them to felonies, if that's what the evidence shows, they connect it to a campaign finance violation. Every juror, all 12 of them, will have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump paid off Stormy Daniels in order to protect his campaign. rather than just protect his family or avoid general embarrassment or anything like that. Donald Trump is undoubtedly not the first wealthy New York man to falsify business records by paying money to somebody he had an affair with. This is an unusual case that way. Many of them are not prosecuted. This one is, and the jump to a felony, which could be other crimes as well, does suggest that Alvin Bragg knows, he's got to hit a home run here. He's under a lot of pressure, and it looks like he's swinging for the fences.
And what makes this particularly unusual and different from the Edwards case is that Donald Trump is denying he had the affairs, right? John Edwards admitted he had the affair, and he was saying, look, I wanted to protect my family, et cetera. Donald Trump's saying it didn't even happen. These affairs just were not true. So that makes it a more sort of complicated defense to some degree.
The other question, too, is why didn't federal prosecutors move forward with this? Why would this be prosecuted at the state level? And that's been untested if this is the route in which they're going.
Right. Well, we have to figure out, are they charging under a state election law crime or a federal election law crime? Yes. But it is definitely the case that the feds decided for a variety of reasons not to prosecute. But so did the local DA. Cyrus Vance, after Michael Cohen pled guilty. Cyrus Vance was the previous DA in Manhattan. Yep. And he had opened this investigation into the hush money and decided not to prosecute for whatever reason. And Alvin Bragg didn't prosecute in his first year or so. And there are going to be real questions that I think he has to answer at the press conference that he's going to hold later today, which is not just what's in the indictment, and it's a question you asked before, David, but why now?
And we'll hope that Alvin Bragg will shed some light on that. He is expected to talk after this arraignment here today in this courtroom. Again, you're looking at a live picture right now, the 15th floor, the only camera in that building. It allowed us to see the former president walking into court, a very stern-looking former president, just a couple of seconds, but finding and locking in on that camera lens. Some would say it plays to his skill set. He knows where to find the camera. He went into the courtroom, and then the only cameras that were in the court are still cameras because his legal team successfully argued before the judge not to have TV cameras in the courtroom, saying it would create a circus-like atmosphere, which explains the still photos. Those photos come to us moments before the proceedings began. Again, our team, Aaron Katersky, John Santucci, Catherine Falders, all joining in reporting at this hour that the indictment is 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. We don't know if that is all of them, but at least 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. The question, as Dan and Kate rightly point out, is how did they get it to that felony level? Are they connecting it to state campaign finance laws, federal laws? Either route would be a challenge for the prosecutor. And again, when we talk about a speaking indictment, it's largely believed that Alvin Bragg in this indictment, once the public gets its hands on it, will offer one of these speaking indictments, essentially the narrative, the story behind why the DA would choose to bring these charges against a former president, would choose to make history in this unprecedented moment that we're witnessing, why they rose to this level. We'll learn much more about all of that as the day wears on. But what you're looking at right now in that hallway, of course, the layers of security, they clearly, you can see it on their faces. This is a day like any other, but in many ways it's not. And I'm sure they know both sides of this. They're there to do their job. We've all come in contact with these officers before, whether it's through jury duty or covering a court case in the past. They just happen to be there on a day when the former president is the criminal defendant. Aaron Katersky continues at his post just outside criminal court. And Aaron, I know you're trying to wrap your head a bit. And again, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but wrapping our head around the idea of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records and how this could perhaps connect directly to Michael Cohen and what he offered the DA.
I can get to 33 so far, David, just based on what we know about the reimbursement of the $130,000 from Donald Trump to Michael Cohen, his one-time fixer and attorney who actually wrote the check to Stormy Daniels in the closing weeks of the 2016 campaign. There were 11 reimbursement checks sent to Michael Cohen, and each of those can represent a count. There's the bad check, there's the bad invoice, and then there's the bad entry on the Trump Organization's general ledger. So 11 reimbursement payments times each of those three things gets you to 33 felony counts, assuming the counts have been elevated by some underlying crime, some reason why the business records were allegedly falsified. What's the 34th count? Still waiting to find out as we wait to get our hands on that indictment, David.
Again, the former president inside court now for well more than a half an hour. As they go down these counts, he has pleaded not guilty to the crimes laid out. And as we were talking earlier, we believe going in, and we wanted to wait until we heard officially, but we believe going in that many of these counts would mirror one another, and that's exactly what we're seeing play out.
Yeah, and you heard Aaron Katersky laying it out there, right? Which is that it's all out of the same series of events, and that there are numerous counts, which is not atypical of prosecutors laying out a case and filing a series of charges. I want to read, though, from the actual definition of falsifying business records in New York State. It's with the intent to defraud that you make or even cause through other means a false entry in an enterprise's business records. Pretty straightforward as to what it is. Now, whether all of these will fall under this section, because there are a number of subsections under this, we shall see. But that's the basic law that you're talking about here. And, there are going to be questions that the defense will raise about what does it mean, the intent to defraud? Well, who were they trying to defraud? Joe Tacopina has been on television many times saying, who was the victim here, et cetera. And there will be debates and discussions about the legal definitions, et cetera. But the law, pretty simple.
I want to bring in Sarah Isgur to join the conversation. Of course, worked in the Trump years with the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General. And Sarah, you see a direct correlation here between the number of counts you're seeing here so far, 34 felony counts, and the guilty plea from Michael Cohen.
Well, another option here, this is all pretty uncharted waters to take this state felony charge and need to tie in, as Dan and Kate were saying, to hide or facilitate some other crime. One possibility, of course, is this will be Donald Trump-related campaign finance violation. But another possibility is to tie it into Michael Cohen's plea deal. He was convicted of a campaign finance violation related to these payments as well. Again, it would be much stronger in that case because they would actually have a federal conviction. Otherwise, you actually have a local district attorney here trying to basically need to prove up a uncharged, unindicted federal case against Donald Trump, which I think will be a much harder uphill battle.
Michael Cohen, of course. Sarah, thank you. Michael Cohen, a pivotal witness in this case. That's not being questioned. There is a lot of incoming for him as well. People have questioned his lies in the past. He's acknowledged lying himself. He said he lied to serve his boss, the former president, when he was an attorney and fixer for him. But Michael Cohen in recent days has been emphatic, John Carl. He said that what he has offered the DA is backed up with paperwork and evidence.
Paperwork and evidence. And think about Michael Cohen, who had been so close to Donald Trump. He at one point said he would take a bullet for Donald Trump. He was about as loyal as anybody I saw around Donald Trump in lead up to the 2016 campaign. And this is somebody who has served time for this very episode. He served more than a year in prison and about a year and a half in home confinement. Now, it wasn't solely related to the Stormy Daniels hush money payments. He also acknowledged and was convicted of lying to Congress on another Trump-related matter regarding the efforts to build a building in Moscow. But Michael Cohen, now the star witness, a flawed witness for those very reasons, but also somebody who has paid dearly, personally. His family has paid for his service to Donald Trump. Time behind bars, time confined to home, his career, his finances ruined because of his association with Donald Trump.
And David, you've spoken about the federal case. Why didn't the Justice Department do anything? Well, first of all, there was Justice Department policy that you could not indict the sitting president. Well, we have to look at the moments after President Trump leaves office. There was this thing called January 6th. And I can tell you their attention immediately focused on what happened, what was the president's role in that. And so this case in their minds became secondary based on all the tea leaves that I've been able to report out. It was not something that DOJ was going to focus on. They have left this to the local prosecutor, in this case, the district attorney, to proceed with. That's why it's going to be so important for us to actually look at these charges and figure out what they're built on. What's the basis of it? The federal investigations are proceeding separate and apart from this, but they know, obviously, that the people's view of the judicial system and whether it's fair or not is being impacted by this case.
I want to bring in Governor Chris Christie, former governor, former prosecutor. Chris, can you explain to the audience why federal authorities did not proceed here and why this would be the Manhattan district attorney who would years later pick up this case?
Well, obviously, we weren't in the room when the decisions were made, but I do think that this is a perfect example of prosecutorial discretion. You know, federal prosecutors and prosecutors throughout the American system are given the discretion, even if they believe a crime may have been committed, to make an evaluation. Is this worth the expenditure of resources compared to the other challenges I have in my particular jurisdiction? And I think it's where Pierre's comments come particularly into focus here. You know, when you look at the timing of all this, no doubt there's DOJ policy that says impeachment is the only way to deal with a sitting president. So now once you get past January 20th, DOJ has to look at the resources they're bringing to bear here. They wanted those resources to be brought to bear on January 6th, I'm sure. And that was a prosecutorial judgment made probably by the Attorney General of the United States and passed down to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York to say, we're not wasting our time and resources on this. Our focus regarding Donald Trump's conduct is going to be on the intervening problem of January 6th and what crimes were committed there by people in his orbit, by the people on Capitol Hill, and ultimately maybe by the president himself. And so, you know, prosecutorial discretion is an important part of what makes our system different than the European system, for instance. And this is where I think Alvin Bragg is going to get himself open for the most criticism. With crime running as rampant as it is, violent crime, in the borough of Manhattan and all across the city of New York, but his jurisdiction, the borough of Manhattan, people are going to wonder, all these resources that are being spent on this matter, a 7-year-old hush money case, is that really making the security and safety of the people of Manhattan better? And is this really what they should spend their time on? DOJ obviously made that determination regarding this versus January 6th. Alvin Bragg's made his determination. They'll both be judged by it.
Legitimate questions, all to be asked in the days and weeks ahead. Chris Christie, thank you. Let's bring in Heidi Heitkamp, former Senator Heitkamp. And Heidi, you've been watching this unfold here today, and just your initial reaction here to learning 34 felony counts of falsifying records.
My initial reaction is Donald Trump is not a happy man. He never likes being in a room where he's not in charge. And so this is a tough day for him. My second thing is, where's Melania? I mean, when you look at this, you can do all the legal analysis, but Donald Trump knows that he's on a huge stage today. Everyone's watching. And behind all of this boring kind of business falsification argument is allegations of sexual liaisons that Donald Trump has not ever agreed that actually happened, but yet the public now is going to see this whole issue opened up again. And so if Donald Trump's going to be successful moving, seeking and securing the presidency, he needs to move one group that he lost between 16 and 20, and that's suburban, Republican-leaning women, and they aren't going to like what they see in this indictment. They aren't going to like, Donald Trump's between a rock and a hard place politically right now, because if he acknowledges the liaison and says it was no big deal, I did this, purposefully, NDAs were signed, then you're going to have a bad political problem with the group that you need to secure for the presidency. And so the political ramifications are very stark here, in my opinion.
We asked the governor, we've asked him, a number of contributors here, Heidi, what they made of the 3 or 4 seconds of the former president going into the courtroom. He lasered in on the camera, those still images of him flanked by his attorneys. You've watched the Trump years unfold. What did you make of those images?
And I've spent time with the president, and if you look there for a moment, he narrows his eyes. It's kind of a stink eye at the camera. I don't think he feels defeated nearly as much as he is seething with anger because he is not in control. He thinks and believes that this is all nonsense, and he's got to go through this very difficult process. And at the end of the day, I think he's smart enough to know this may reignite the MAGA base. He may be the martyr for the MAGA movement. But this is not a procedure that helps him secure the presidency of the United States.
Heidi Heitkamp. Heidi, we always appreciate your contributions as well. Our thanks to you and to Governor Christie. I want to bring in Mark Updegrove, presidential historian, LBJ Library, of course, in Austin. And Mark, just big picture here for people watching, and no matter what your opinion is about Donald Trump, what your opinion is about this particular case, knowing that there are a multitude of other cases out there still, coming down the tracks here. What do you make of the unprecedented nature of this day?
Well, you said it, David, and we hear it time and time and time again as it relates to Donald Trump. Unprecedented. I think it was mentioned earlier that infamous trip down the escalator at Trump Tower when Trump announced his candidacy. That was unprecedented. So much he did during his campaign in 2015 and 2016, unprecedented. So much he did in the White House as president, unprecedented, and now as a former president. This is truly unprecedented. I think what strikes me in this moment, David, is the somberness, the weight. You can feel it. It's palpable in the scene that we're seeing there. In that photograph you showed of Donald Trump earlier before the judge, you could see it in Trump's countenance. And I think it reminds me most of another unprecedented occasion when Richard Nixon resigned from office in 1974. You could feel the weight of the occasion in that moment as well. You could see it on Nixon's face. And I think this image here that we're seeing before us now will become one of the icons of our age. For now, it'll be a symbol of defiance for Trump supporters, for those detractors of Donald Trump, a symbol of his criminality. But certainly that is an image that we'll see that will symbolize this very divided age in which we are right now.
It's a really interesting comparison, Mark, and you point out the similarities. Let me ask you about one thing, at least, that's distinctively different, and that is the fact that a number, if not most, Republicans on the Hill have rallied behind this president. We know, ultimately Republicans came in to tell Richard Nixon that essentially this was over. You're facing impeachment.
And David, that is the marked difference here. You're absolutely right. Prior to Nixon's resignation in August of 1974, congressional Republicans came to the Oval Office to tell Richard Nixon that he faced almost certain impeachment in the House and likely conviction in the Senate, so he should resign for the good of the country. The Republicans were almost united in that respect. Americans were far less divided at that time. Richard Nixon left with an approval rating of just 24%. As a comparison, Donald Trump, even after January 6th, left with an approval rating of 34% and is now, as has been mentioned, the lead candidate for the Republican nomination. We saw in the wake of these charges, his poll numbers increase, his lead against DeSantis widen, and money pour into the Trump campaign. Again, another symbol of the very divided times in which we live.
And part of the unprecedented nature of this moment, and it will be fascinating to watch unfold, is what these Republican candidates do and say in the weeks and months ahead with all of these other cases pending, Mark. I'm curious if that's something, obviously, that you wait and will be watching closely. If there's a shift in tone, once you see where these other cases could potentially go with the Jack Smith, the special counsel investigating January 6th, the documents at Mar-a-Lago, not just the documents themselves, but obviously allegations of obstruction, and in Fulton County, Georgia, and the allegations that there was some pressure to, find the votes. People remember that recording. Whether or not Republican candidates who right now would like the nomination themselves, but are still supporting Donald Trump, if that political calculation will change, given what we see in the months ahead here.
It's interesting, David, we saw Trump come out with those NFT cards, those trading cards, a little while back, and one of them was of him as a superhero. But there has not yet been kryptonite for Donald Trump. This is another drip in the wake that affects Trump's candidacy. We have to remember that while he retains great strength among a certain segment of the Republican Party, he lost the election in 2020. There was a disastrous midterm for the Republicans last year as mostly around the election deniers who were in Trump's camp. So we'll see what this charge and the charges in those other cases do to erode Trump's credibility and affect his candidacy for the presidency next year. It's anybody's guess. He has been almost impossible to predict. We use the term.
Again, the Zoom connection tests us all the time, but that was quite a tease for Mark Updegrove. We'll get his final part of that thought because it was a good one. And I do want to bring in Rick Klein, our political director, because Rick, as our eyes are trained, there's some activity here, Secret Service coming out. Let's just stick with this live picture for a moment. There he is, the former president. Let's listen.
President Trump, how did you plead? President Trump. Everyone is to stay put.
And there you have it. A rarity right there playing out, too. I mean, the back of his head, it is rare that with questions being tossed his way, that the former president would ignore them. But in this moment, he did.
Especially with the question that was shouted at him, how did you plead? I mean, I've been in that situation where you just want to say something to get a response, and he's usually pretty predictable. That was a pretty good line to put in the water because he could have just turned around and said, not guilty, but he didn't. Again, it could be a seething anger that we will see erupt when he gets back to Mar-a-Lago, or more of that melancholy that we've said, or maybe some of both. But that is, I think we can agree, not a happy Donald Trump.
Not a happy Donald Trump. His eyes pierced the camera on the way in. On the way out, he was really tested by one of those reporters, and for years it was Hugh John Garl. And as you say, lobbed one of those questions, very simple. He said going in, through our reporting, that we knew there'd be a not guilty plea. Look, but what we didn't know was whether he would offer that himself. This was the opportunity, as you say. But in that moment, he decided not to. And, he has a skill set. And I'm sure we'll see later on today perhaps an indication as to why he didn't think this was the particular moment. Rick Klein, as we look at this hallway, this is the 15th floor, obviously, of criminal court. Donald Trump has now left after almost an hour, I believe. We'll get a direct number on how long he was actually in that courtroom as they read the indictment. Rick is our political director. You'll remember him from election night over at the big board. And Rick, I just always like to help folks at home remember the big picture here. And regardless of whether or not he has pleaded not guilty here, 34 felony counts our team is reporting of falsifying business records. Regardless of this, of the history made today, this does not impact whether or not someone can run for president. He will move forward full steam ahead in his race for the White House.
There is nothing that stops him from continuing his campaign for the presidency. There's nothing that stops him from even being elected to the presidency, even if he's under indictment, even if he is potentially convicted. His campaign sending out a fundraising appeal with a fake mugshot, a mugshot that does not exist, asking for people to contribute. That's the campaign public face that they're trying to put on this, the spin they're trying to put on this. I think, though, the dour images of Trump in that courtroom speak more truthfully to the reality of this moment. And I think it's a mistake to assume that this helps him politically. Yes, there are Republicans rallying to his defense, but they're doing so around the idea that this prosecutor is overreaching, that he is out of control. They're not rallying to his defense around the substance of these charges, and they will play out over months and months, a year plus, as John Carl pointed out. It could be in the context not just of the Republican primary, but the general election. That's where he may see a lot more political vulnerability. This is a real thing now. This changes and resets everything around the presidential nominating contest, even as Trump forges ahead with his campaign.
Well, just look at this, Rick. We're looking at live pictures of the motorcade already on the move. That shows you how quickly you could get out of that criminal courthouse if you're given the elevator reserved for judges, which is what our reporting tells us in the case of Donald Trump today. We have color from inside the courtroom. Our Catherine Falder's reporting that the former president did enter the not guilty plea himself, and that it was Todd Blanche. This is the new attorney that Donald Trump brought onto the team in the last 24 hours, at least acknowledged it publicly that there had been an additional defense attorney added who did most of the speaking inside that courtroom here.
And David, as you see those images of the motorcade leaving. What the Secret Service wants to do, get him in and get him out. They wanted this to be very businesslike, professional. I think they probably even negotiated with the Trump team that he probably wouldn't do much speaking at the courthouse, either before or after. That's what you're seeing unfold. He will be moving toward the airport promptly, we're being told. So again, for their part, the security of getting the president in the building, have him processed, have the proceeding go forward, then move him out, because trust me, the Secret Service wants to be out of this business. They want him on the campaign, all of the things that he will do going forward in a more normal sense. This was anything but normal. They had to put together the security package. He's now in the security bubble. Now they want to get him out of the city and back to Mar-a-Lago.
They want him back on that plane. They want New Yorkers safe and the former president safe. And if they can say that at the end of the day, they will have done their job. The Secret Service and the NYPD. And, you know, the officers who turn up at court every single day who we saw on cameras here for a good portion of this afternoon. As we look at this live picture of the motorcade, John, I know that you've been in touch with Catherine Falders and our team with a little more of how this played out inside that courtroom.
A little bit, David. They're being very controlling right now. Our team is still inside the courtroom, but I'm being told by ABC's Laura Romero, president, as we've reported, David, pled not guilty, 34 counts. Laura says the president was calm throughout the proceedings, spoke very quietly, David, apparently only speaking to enter that not guilty plea and then whispering to his lawyers as the proceedings were ongoing. But we're still getting a readout from the team in there, David. I think they'll be hopefully out shortly and will be able to join us in our coverage.
Yep, raise your hand as soon as you hear from any of them, and we will go to them just for a description of inside that court. Here is an image right now of the former president leaving the courtroom. This is, of course, moments ago, since you're watching the motorcade on the left-hand side of your screen. But again, as quickly as he went into the courthouse today, no interest on his part of approaching those cameras. Perhaps that was just part of the speculation at the beginning of the day, or the bravado, until the heaviness of the moment starts to sink in.
And I think it was smart, right? I think he dealt with it the right way, which is it's smarter for him to just take the proceeding itself seriously, go back to Mar-a-Lago, hold a press conference tonight where he completely bashes the DA and the entire process, right? At least it allows him to separate it out and to not suggest that he's not even taking this seriously, et cetera.
Completely bashes? You think you'll hear some of the same rhetoric?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, John would know better than me, but I would expect we're going to hear the same level of rhetoric. I don't think anything will have fundamentally changed from just having been in the courtroom. I would expect that he's going to bash the DA, he's going to bash the charges, et cetera, right?
There are no ramifications for that now that he's appeared before
the
judge?
No, I think, look, he's got his freedom of speech, he's got his right to make comments. As long as there's not a gag order in place about the case, he can say what he wants.
Really, there's no legal calculation now.
I mean, certainly the lawyers will counsel him to keep it down. You don't win any points by irritating or personally attacking a judge, by seeming to intimidate a prosecutor or witnesses. But Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and as we were talking about earlier, this is now his presidential campaign. Yeah. He's not just attacking Democrats anymore. He's just not attacking Joe Biden. As a matter of fact, that's going to become secondary. It already, in a way, has become secondary to his main focus, which is to say that he has been a victim, that these prosecutors are out to get him, and they're out to get him because what they're really out to get is they're out to get you, my supporters, across America.
John, as you and I both know, as we study these live images right now, the person who will be studying these images the moment he's on that plane is the former president.
You know, he was watching cable television last night. Can you imagine? You come into New York, you know, the night before you're going to be indicted. He's huddled with, as we've reported, his legal team, but also his handful of political aides. No family to speak of. Eric Trump was on hand for at least part of it, but he's there. He's hate-watching cable television, looking at how it's playing, how it's being covered. And I can guarantee you that's what will be on his airplane as he flies back to West Palm Beach. No question.
And will he ask the question that you've heard before? You know, how did that play? My moment looking at the camera. Do you think that was the right way to handle that?
I mean, he's going to be doing that, and he's going to be focused on what's going to happen tonight. And I think that one measure of how worried he is now, concerned he is about all of this, is does he stick to the script tonight? Because there will be a script.
I gather that script is being
undoubtedly, yes,
tweaked as we speak.
Yes.
Now, whether or not he goes along with the tweaks, the suggestions from his team.
Yeah, and what he
seen.
does, but even after that, the question is, does he read what's in the prompter?
Well, we're getting an interesting headline coming in right now. I want to go to Aaron Gutersky, who's in Lower Manhattan, because, Aaron, there was something the judge had requested when it comes to social media. Tell us about this and how far did this get?
Well, we know that the arraignment itself, him pleading not guilty, David, took just minutes. But part of the reason why he was in there for the better part of an hour is the prosecutors gave a rather lengthy soliloquy in court. Part of that included showing the judge images of at least 2 threats that have been made to Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who was there seated in the courtroom. And they asked the judge for a protective order in the case over all of the discovery, over all of the evidence that needs to be shared with the defense. We'll get a read shortly as to whether the judge granted it, but it just goes to show how charged this entire criminal case has been, that the prosecutors are asking for that protective order and making the judge aware of the threats to the prosecutor. Alvin Bragg had received a white powder in the mail in the basement of this building. It also contained a letter that said, "Alvin, I'm going to kill you." That followed one of the president's social media messages asking his supporters to protest on his behalf.
And again, just to reiterate what Aaron Gutersky is reporting at this hour, prosecutors, part of what took up this time when we did not see activity, and we were waiting for activity in that hallway for the president to reemerge, part of that time was taken up by prosecutors who were making the case before this judge, Juan Merchan, that there should be some sort of a protective order, at least when it comes to social media, given the threats against the district attorney in this case, Alvin Bragg. That, according to reporting moments ago from Aaron Gutersky, what's unclear at this point, and this is the part of the sort of the fog of when we watch these events unfold, and not an event like this because this is unprecedented, but we will have more information as to whether or not that was granted by the judge a short time from now. We'll go back to Aaron as soon as he learns. I want to bring in Olivia Rubin, who's on the phone. Olivia is with our investigative unit. And Olivia, you witnessed some of this today. What can you offer as far as the temperature in that room inside that courthouse?
That's right, David. I'm standing right outside the courthouse right now, and I can tell you we just ran out, and the temperature inside of that courtroom was very high. It was very tense, and like you've noted, it was an incredibly long hearing. It ran almost an hour. I can say one of the most remarkable moments was when the former president entered into that courtroom, and I can honestly only describe his face as almost having a grimace on it as he made his way to the front of the room where he sat at the defendant's table. And I know this was hinted at earlier, David, on the broadcast, but this is the former president of the United States entering into the courtroom as a defendant. And David, he had to wait in his chair there for the judge until the judge eventually came in. He told the former president to stand. He stood up. Trump sat back down, and ultimately the judge said, "Let's arraign Mr. Trump." And Trump entered that guilty plea on his own. He said, "Not guilty." And that was what kicked off sort of this longer hearing where the prosecutors brought up a number of issues. I know you mentioned the protective order. It seemed from the discussions that there was some agreement between the prosecutors and the defense that there could be this protective order as it pertains to discovery material. The prosecutors said that they only wanted Trump to have access to some of these materials in certain ways so that he could not disseminate them. The defense agreeing to some, the judge ultimately not weighing in. But I do also want to go to this remarkable moment that sort of sparked this conversation about the threats, where the prosecutor brought up the post. Of course, he has attacked the judge. He has attacked Bragg himself, who was in the room there. And this moment, David, where one of the prosecutors actually passed around copies of Trump's social media posts attacking people who were in that very room. And he walked over and he put those posts on Trump's defense table, David.
A remarkable scene described by Olivia Rubin. Stick with us here, Olivia. Olivia describing how events unfolded inside that courtroom, Judge Juan Merchan's courtroom. Olivia describing the former president walking in. We saw the version from the hallway. Olivia saw it from inside the room, describing the grimace, the former president sitting down at the defense table, the judge in that courtroom asking the former president to stand. Asking him what his plea was. Olivia describing the former president in his own words, saying not guilty, something that we thought would play out and did in fact play out in that courtroom. Olivia, I wanted to ask you more about the threats, because this is going to be part of this story unfolding that we're still learning about, this request from the prosecution that the judge impose some sort of protective order about threats moving forward, dangerous rhetoric, social media, if you will. What more can you tell us about that? And what was the reaction? You mentioned some of this was put on the defense table, I gather, in front of the former president. Was there any reaction?
David, we could not see the former president the entire time there, but what I can say is that he sat in his seat and he was essentially stone-faced, looking forward. He did not crack a smile. He didn't seem to turn around and take in the room while he was sitting there. Of course, he would lean side to side as his attorneys would whisper in his ears. He looked attentively as he was speaking. He would blink and take it in. There was this moment where the prosecutors brought up potentially a conflict of interest with one of Trump's attorneys, and the judge looked directly at the former president and said, I want to inform you that you have the right for conflict-free representation. Do you understand that? It appears that the president nodded, which the judge didn't seem was good enough. He put his hand to his ear and he said, I can't hear you. And the president had to speak up again and say yes. And so it was those types of moments that made it so abundantly clear that the former president in this room was a defendant, David. He was at the will of the judge, and he had to sit through, as we've described, what was nearly a 1-hour hearing. And by the end, the judge was reading to him sort of these, what he described as, commonplace, usual directions that he gives to all defendants. And as he was ticking through them, the former president is sitting in his seat and he's saying, yes, yes. And I have to say, by this point of the hearing, the former president's voice had gone a little bit hoarse. It was not forceful. It was not projected. He had kind of gotten to the end of his line here almost, and that is sort of where the hearing ended.
Really important reporting from our investigative reporter and producer, Olivia Rubin. And one last question before I move on here, Olivia, because you were also the first window to Judge Juan Merchan for us as well. There had been some question about what the demeanor would be in that courtroom, business as usual, and what this is like when you juxtapose someone who has the skill set of the former president in the public eye, the public sphere, entering that courtroom, and how quickly the dynamic shifts when you're a criminal defendant. You're describing a situation where the judge is, asking for an answer and says, I can't hear you, asking the former president to speak up, if you will. It would sound like the judge, and you tell me, seemed to be making it clear that at least in that courtroom, he was the one leading the way, the one in charge here.
Absolutely. And there were give and takes throughout the hearing, David. There were times when the judge would listen and he would say, of course, this is an exceptional circumstance. And he acknowledged what it took to simply get the former president into the courtroom today and the resources it took from the city, from the Secret Service, from all aspects. But there were also times when he would say, I do want to say this is what we would do with another defendant. So, for example, he did not outright allow the former president to not attend the next hearing in the case, which is, as of now, set for December. He said, in the interest of transparency, he could need to be here. There was not a final decision on that, but even just that ruling right there gives you a sense of what could be in store here. He did say, sorry, it's a bit loud outside the courthouse, but he did say he did not want to impose a gag order. He did not think we were there at all, because just like every other defendant, the former president has rights here.
Olivia Rubin with us. Olivia Rubin, who is our investigative reporter on the investigative unit here at ABC. She was in that courtroom describing somewhat of a surreal scene, though all of this has been today. A situation where she says there was give and take between the judge, Juan Merchan, and the former president, Donald Trump. Moments when the judge asked him to essentially, speak up. I can't hear you. The former president pleading not guilty himself in his own words, standing before the judge, but also a judge who understood the historic nature of what was unfolding in his courtroom, respectful of the fact that there was a former president standing before him, and the extraordinary nature of this case and the security involved, the logistics involved in getting the former president into that building up to that 15th floor. In her words, there was give and take, and that is also encouraging because this was certainly a test of the legal system. And again, Dan, you and I have been talking about all afternoon here, this sort of this moment in history where the political world, clashes with the legal world in a really significant way. But, that scene described as polite, assertive on both sides, and a request before that judge from prosecutors about some sort of protection moving forward when it comes to social media and the number of threats. But I do want to get to the indictment because we do have it in our hands. A number of us do. I want to get right to Aaron Katersky first because, Aaron, you have covered these indictments in criminal court for us for many years. What stands out to you so far?
Well, David, it is not a speaking indictment, as you were discussing. There is no language other than the straight matters of the criminal charges, 34 of them, to which former President Trump pleaded not guilty, uttering those words in his own voice before Judge Juan Merchan. It simply says the defendant in the county of New York and elsewhere, beginning on February 14, 2017, with intent to defraud and intent to commit another crime, and aid and conceal the commission thereof, made and caused a false entry in the business records of an enterprise. This is how the district attorney's office has elevated a charge that is normally a misdemeanor to a felony because it was done with the intent to commit another crime and conceal the commission of another crime. That other crime, as we understand it, is a conspiracy to promote or prevent the election of 2 or more people in New York. David.
Aaron Katersky, outside criminal court. Aaron, stick with us here because we're just getting a statement now from the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, who is expected to address the public here a short time from now. I want to read from this statement for those of you at home. The DA, Alvin Bragg, today announcing the indictment of Donald J. Trump. And this is important here because this helps to describe, as Aaron said, the list of charges, the counts, without much of an explanation in the indictment. Well, here's where he's filling the blanks here. He says, Alvin Bragg indicting Donald Trump for falsifying New York business records in order to conceal damaging information and unlawful activity from American voters before and after the 2016 election. The DA's office goes on to say, during the election, Trump and others employed a, quote, catch and kill scheme to identify, purchase, and bury negative information about him and to boost his electoral prospects. That would seem to be the first significant window from the DA's office, Dan.
It is, but as a legal matter, I think that the 34 counts, it appears, just relate to the $130,000 payout to Stormy Daniels. So what it seems to me, and Kate can correct me or Pierre can correct me if they think I'm wrong, but it seems to me that what they've done is they've laid out the context for what was happening, right, in this press release. They basically talked about how from 2015 to 2017 that Trump orchestrated a catch and kill scheme, as you pointed out, through a series of payments. But when it comes to the actual charges, it goes down to say, in total, 34 false entries were made in New York business records to conceal the initial covert $130,000 payment. And that seems to be where the charges are stemming from as we go through this. And each one of the charges, as Aaron Katersky had laid it out, relate to either a check or a false recording in their business records, an invoice, a marked record. Each one of those is considered another count here. And as we expected, they have said that a violation, and it's unclear if it's state or federal, because it says here, including attempts to violate state and federal election laws, which seems to be what took this from a misdemeanor to a felony. And Pierre seems to...
There's another key line in here which underscores what you're saying here. The DA's office saying in this press release, Trump is charged in a New York State Supreme Court indictment with 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree, which signals that it's a felony. But again, all 34 counts directly related to falsifying business records, Kate.
They are, and the press release accompanying the indictment suggests that the scheme itself is being charged as a scheme designed to bury negative information to boost the former president's electoral prospects, and there's a reference made to attempts to violate both state and federal election laws. So the scheme is sort of being charged as the one we have been anticipating, but there's not as much clarity as you might expect in some of these documents regarding what specific federal and state election laws are being used to boost this misdemeanor to a felony, now, or these misdemeanors to felonies. Now, it's not that those need to be charged separately, right? The way this New York law works is it becomes a felony if committed in furtherance of another crime. You don't have to prove or actually even charge the other crime, but the sort of generality of the reference to the other crimes is surprising, at least to me. We don't yet know the full legal theory.
And David, we'll have to print out the statement of facts that accompanies the indictment. But what you essentially see from the district attorney here is he's making the case that this was a conspiracy to use this catch and kill philosophy, i.e., we're going to take this story out from the public domain so it never sees the light of day. So, in fact, Donald Trump can continue his effort to become the president of the United States. And they're saying that it violates both state and federal law, that scheme.
You catch the story, you pay for it, but then you never print it. You catch and kill it. That's the allegation here. And again, this is the indictment, which isn't a speaking indictment, but you can get the sense of the size of this here. These are the charges laid out, and then what we're basing so far, the narrative provided by the DA comes in a two-page sort of press release, if you will. Alvin Bragg is going to address the public a short time from now. He'll face many of the questions, the open-ended questions that we have here at the table. John?
David, there's also an introduction here, in addition to the press statement and the list of counts, that goes through in detail this catch and release process that was going on, and it's described. And there's some new details in here, but it's describing the head of the company that owned the National Enquirer telling Trump in a meeting at Trump Tower in 2015 that this is David Pecker, would act as his eyes and ears for the campaign by looking out for negative stories about the defendant and alerting lawyer A before the stories were published. That lawyer A, of course, would be Michael Cohen. One of the stories mentioned specifically is a story revolving a Trump Tower doorman who, it says, that in between October and November of 2015, was trying to sell information regarding a child that the defendant allegedly fathered out of wedlock. And the AMI CEO, that's David Pecker's direction, AMI negotiated and signed an agreement to pay the doorman $30,000 to acquire exclusive rights to that story. Again, catch the story and then bury it.
Again, these are the allegations laid out in this indictment.
And then there's another woman that's mentioned here, not named, but another woman that is mentioned who was also paid $150,000, so a little bit more than Stormy Daniels got, to suppress her story of having an affair with Donald Trump while he was married to his current wife, Melania.
I just want to remind the audience, and for those who are with us every day, you remember this, but you have reported in recent days how David Pecker was back before the grand jury.
He was among the first witnesses, and he was the final witness.
But we still have to get, I think, an answer from Alvin Bragg at the press conference as to why now. We still don't have that answer. This is interesting and it's fascinating, and this is sort of along the lines of what we expected. But there's not a lot new here. I mean, we knew about these various allegations. We knew about the various payoffs. I think that Alvin Bragg still owes the public an explanation as to why did he decide to begin this grand jury at this point, well over a year into his term. Why did the previous DA, who had opened the case after Michael Cohen pled guilty, and there are a lot of people who've been focusing on a comment that Cyrus Vance made on television where he said that he had been asked to stand down by the feds, but this is now after that. He opened it and decided not to charge. These are questions that I think that the DA has to answer at this press conference. It is not answered from the press release and is not answered from the indictment.
Some of the details we have reported out, some are new, as John Carl points out, and we were aware of catch and kill. We had reported on that over the course of many years here, but the fact that he's pointing to it directly as a scheme that led to this and that helped build this indictment today. I want to bring in Terry Moran because, Terry, the big question going into today was how would a state prosecutor connect the falsification of banking records, if you will, to something that would impact an election? How do you draw the link? And it would appear it's this scheme being described in the indictment.
Right, which describes hush money payments to several people, not just one, that this was a pattern and practice during the 2016 election. And it turns out, as Aaron Katursky heard from his sources, there is a section of New York State's election law, Section 17-152, which says any two or more persons who conspire to promote or prevent the election of any person to a public office by unlawful means, and which conspiracy is acted upon by one or more of the parties, shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. Now, that could be connected. That's a New York State crime. But if it is a conspiracy to use unlawful means, falsifying business records would be that. Although Aaron is also hearing that they are involving federal campaign law. And then that gets into the question, why is a state prosecutor empowered to enforce federal campaign law? Federal government isn't going to like state prosecutors running around making cases on that. There's preemption issues, as they call it. There's other issues as well. And so there may be a lot of legal fighting about the nature of these charges before you get to any witness and evidence in trial.
And the state prosecutor making the case that this somehow affected a direct correlation with federal election law is the part of this, Terry, that's really untested.
Very untested. It is a reach. This prosecution is a reach. Obviously, they've got them dead to rights on falsifying documents, falsifying business documents, but then to latch it into the crime of either the New York State election law or federal election law is a leap, and it needs to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 people, and that may be tough.
Pierre?
Yeah, one of the things that's quite interesting here is that the statement of facts, which we now have and have printed out, is what speaks for the indictment. It lays out the narrative. But the key witness in this case, based on the reading of this, will be the publisher of the National Enquirer, because he can speak to, one would think, whether Donald Trump himself was aware of this catch and kill scheme and participated in it. One of the things that Michael Cohen stated when he was pleading guilty to the federal charges is that it was done at the direction of individual A, who we now know is former President Donald Trump. Now, whether they have the evidence to prove that Donald Trump was a willing participant in this, directed it, is what we have yet to see. What is the evidence that they can show that he was directly involved, knew what was going on, and wanted it to happen?
I think it's really interesting, Pierre, because people at home are going to say, well, we've heard so much about Stormy Daniels, we've heard so much about Michael Cohen, but Pierre Thomas just said the key witness in this case will be David Pecker and the alleged involvement or interaction that involved a catch and kill scheme.
Exactly. Because, again, he's the person that's orchestrating it. He's catching the story and killing it so that it never sees the light of day. So the key is, what was his conversation with Donald Trump, if any? What was his conversation with Michael Cohen? What was his understanding of what was to take place?
And what did he tell the DA?
Exactly.
Behind closed doors. All right, let's bring in John Santucci for more on the scheme that they're laying forward here, John, the alleged scheme.
David, the most fascinating thing to me in reading this statement of facts is that, everybody and us thought Michael Cohen was the sole narrator of this story. Reading this statement of facts, this seems like it's a story told by Michael Cohen and David Pecker. They talked through, David, in this statement of facts, how this was not a one-time occurrence in this relationship. That David Pecker, who was the publisher of the National Enquirer, when they would get wind of a story that was bad for Donald Trump, they would reach out to Michael Cohen and, as we've said, make a deal to catch the story and then make it go away, to kill it. They give the examples of the first woman that was a $150,000 payment, that being Karen McDougal, who gave an interview right around the 2016, right after the 2016 election, and talked about what a relationship she had with Donald Trump. Far more significant, frankly, in her telling of it than Stormy Daniels. They talk about a doorman who wanted to sell a damaging story against Trump, another catch and kill there, and they talk about Stormy Daniels. But that one seems to be a little different, but nevertheless, Pecker and Cohen working in tandem on all of these. It's a really interesting story, quite frankly, that the DA's office tries to show. And, you know, we've thrown that word conspiracy out there a lot. Certainly in the statement of facts, they are talking about a conspiracy in the sense that this was a trend. This was not a one-time deal that happened. It seemed to be a rinse and repeat relationship for Cohen and Pecker, all to the benefit of Donald Trump.
John Santucci, our thanks to you. Keep pouring through along with the rest of the team here. I want to bring in former Governor Chris Christie. And Chris, I'm curious, are you at all surprised at the role David Pecker seems to be playing as far as his seems to be a very significant witness here for the DA?
No, in fact, on Sunday when I was on the This Week show with George, he asked me what did I think was going to be different or new. And I looked at him and said 2 words, David Pecker. Look, I disagree a bit with some who have said they think this is a reach. Look, if in fact, it doesn't seem to me that federal campaign finance law needs to be involved in any way here. The crime is to try to essentially defraud the voters of the state of New York by trying to either help or impede the election or defeat of 2 or more candidates, which would be Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And Pecker is the guy. And I think what may have changed here with Alvin Bragg is maybe David Pecker was willing to come forward now and be cooperative because in the federal case, there was a lot of back and forth with Pecker about what he would do or not do. And Pecker, presumably, does not have the same infirmities that Michael Cohen would have as a witness. One, you haven't seen David Pecker anywhere. You haven't seen him on television giving any interviews or doing anything else. I haven't seen this guy for a long time. And I certainly haven't seen him making any public comments as opposed to Michael Cohen, who seems to be as addicted as his former boss is to getting in front of a TV camera. So my guess as to what's going on here is that the single most important witness, as was said earlier by Pierre, you don't have to prove these 34 falsification counts. They're not going to be difficult to prove. And Cohen will probably have the most to do with that. And I don't think it'll be hard to prove. The key is going to be proving the underlying crime that elevates it to a felony. And I think there is going to be one most important witness, and that's going to be David Pecker.
We have pulled the transcript. We'll give you complete credit for having predicted some of this on Sunday morning. Our thanks to you, Governor Christie. Thank you very much. And so you heard Chris Christie there, former prosecutor himself, Dan and Kate, talking about it. You know, there's been this discussion about the violation of campaign finance law, or you know, that he's saying that perhaps that discussion needs to be put aside, and we need to really be focusing on David Pecker here and a scheme. And he says, and that's what the DA is now trying to lay out.
So I think that there are 2 separate issues here, right? One is the technicalities of the law, and the other is prosecutorial discretion. The technicalities of the law are exactly what Chris Christie was talking about there, which is, does this fit into the category of a violation of the law? Can you prove it? Can you prove that Donald Trump knew about it? And then with regard to the rising it to a felony, that's where Pecker becomes really important, because he will come forward, presumably, and testify. And it says here, actually, in the statement of facts, Section 23 says the defendant thanked the AMI CEO for handling the stories of the doorman and woman 1 and invited the AMI CEO to the inauguration. In the summer of 2017, the defendant invited the AMI CEO to the White House for a dinner to thank him for his help during the campaign. Where do you think they're getting that from? They're getting it from David Pecker.
From David Pecker.
Is telling them that.
We're going to hear from the DA in a moment, but right now, all eyes on Donald Trump walking up the stairwell to his plane. He will fly back to Mar-a-Lago. He's expected to address reporters in Mar-a-Lago tonight with some sort of a statement, though unclear how much of that will change now given what's played out here before us. be fascinating, of course, obviously, to be on that plane for this 2 to 3 hour flight back down to Mar-a-Lago, John. But the president will no doubt be watching coverage and reacting to the indictment that he only saw moments before he entered that courtroom.
No doubt about it. And there's another line of narrative in this statement of facts, and it regards the pressure that Donald Trump was putting on Michael Cohen not to tell the truth. And it describes 2 of Donald Trump's lawyers in communication with Michael Cohen and promising to be a back channel with the president. And some of this stuff is really quite interesting. First of all, they point out that Donald Trump had actually tweeted after Michael Cohen's apartment was searched. Most people will flip if the government lets them out of trouble, even if it means lying or making up stories. I don't see Michael Cohen doing that. But then it describes Cohen being approached by lawyer C is the way it's defined here, which is defined as one of the defendant's lawyers, as offering a back channel of communication with the defendant, with Donald Trump, and saying this could not be a better situation for the president or for you. I spoke with another Trump lawyer, very, very positive. You are loved. Sleep well tonight. You have friends in high places. What this sounds to me like is the suggestion that Michael Cohen was going to be protected by Donald Trump. And what I actually asked Trump about the day after his Michael Cohen's home was raided was, are you considering a pardon for Michael Cohen? And I'll never forget the reaction, because Trump glared at me, looked at me and said, that's a stupid question. Stupid question. And it really got to him. This implication here, it seems to me, is that through these intermediaries, Michael Cohen was being assured that the president was going to take care of him as long as he didn't testify against him. How do you take care of him? It's a pardon.
Question that you asked. You know, I do think there's another question out there, too, and that is whether or not the previous Manhattan DA had the cooperation, the full cooperation of David Pecker, the way Alvin Bragg seems to. He seems to be a crucial part of this indictment, and I think that's going to be a central question for...
But he's not unassailable either. Remember, he ran a really seedy publication for a long time that did a lot of dirty work, right? So let's not start treating David Pecker as if he's going to be some witness that's going to come in with totally clean hands, et cetera.
Well,
right?
I'm certainly not elevating him and putting him on a pedestal. What I'm asking, though, is because there have been questions about why the other DA didn't move forward and why Alvin Bragg did. I wonder if this will be part of the answer moving forward. It's just a question that's out there.
I think that's right. I think look, Chris Christie made that point, and it strikes me as being absolutely, potentially true. We don't know exactly what the difference is between what he was willing to do before and what he's willing to do now.
And just one little development also. In 2021, the National Enquirer's parent company paid an almost $200,000 Federal Election Commission fine specifically regarding the Karen McDougal payments. So I'm not sure how exactly the timing works out, but this is something the Federal Election Commission did look at, and there was an actual settlement reached. So other investigators to the kind of, well, why haven't the feds looked at this? Actually, as to one aspect of the scheme, the feds did take a look, and the FEC actually imposed a civil penalty.
And David, to pick up on what Dan was saying, this reference to President Trump having a conversation with Pecker about his gratefulness for catching and killing these stories. Again, we don't know the specifics. We don't yet know what Pecker would say in court. We don't know those details. But that's going to be critical, is how detailed is that information? We don't know what his credibility will be, but there is this notion pointed to in this statement of facts that the president was aware of what was done, that's the suggestion, and was happy about it having been done. So we need to dig into that. Pecker will be a person that everyone wants to try to interview right now. We need to know the answer to those questions before we can make some final assessments.
And as we look at that live picture of the plane, he hasn't taken off yet, the former president, to go back to Mar-a-Lago. But, John, I'd be fascinated to know how angry, perhaps, the former president is to have learned the level to which it appears David Pecker has cooperated with the DA and with prosecutors here.
Yeah, Donald Trump hasn't always been good to understate things at being loyal to those that have been loyal to him, but he has demanded loyalty. And here you have two people who are extremely close to him. His fixer, Michael Cohen, his good friend, David Pecker. And we know Michael Cohen turned on him, 5 years ago. But now we're learning that David Pecker, somebody he did consider a friend, has turned on him. And he will be seething in anger at that. Again, this is somebody that isn't always so good at conveying loyalty to others, but he demands it.
In return, no question about that. And in fact, we're seeing that another new chapter of that in tracking the Republicans who are supporting him right now. Rachel Scott has reported that not only is he calling for support, but then keeping track of those who are with him and those who are not, particularly with him ahead in the polls and growing, at least right now, in these last couple of days. I want to bring in Olivia Rubin again, the reporter who was inside that courtroom, because this was something that we had all talked about here at the desk, which is the political calculation, because there's this race for the White House playing out right now. And Olivia, both sides got a chance to say when ideally this trial would begin if it goes to trial, and there were two different dates thrown out.
Absolutely. They in a way got right down to business, with the prosecutor telling the judge that they were eyeing a January 2024 trial date. Of course, that's right in the middle of that election year. Trump's attorney got up. Todd Blanche, he said that felt aggressive to him. They said maybe something more towards the spring, obviously trying to push it back a little bit there, with the judge ultimately weighing in. He did not pick a date or anything of the sort, but he said, I would like to move this ahead.
But the defense actually pushing it to the spring, or suggesting at least, which gets it even closer to Election Day.
Exactly, that's right. And again, the judge not weighing in on dates. Of course, he did set that date for December, just at the end of this year, for Trump to potentially have to come back to Manhattan, come back to court. The attorneys will be there. The question is, will Trump be there? But this does not seem like something that's going away, or something that Trump himself will not have to be dealing with.
Really interesting information coming in from Olivia Rubin. Again, this timetable is not set in stone, not even close, but there were some dates thrown out in court. The judge suggesting that both sides would have to return the end of this year, but that perhaps if this goes to trial, the prosecution suggesting January of 24, obviously the beginning of this coming year. Less than a year away, January 24, right in the height of a presidential campaign. The defense team reacting, saying, let's push that back a little bit to spring of 24. And we all know that in November of 24 is going to be, election night in America. So this is something that will play out right in the middle of a presidential campaign. You're looking live right now at the podium where it's believed the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, who has a number of questions to answer. Dan Abrams has a number of them for him. And so do the reporters in that room about the theory behind this indictment, why now, why this indictment, and how strong he believes this scheme that he has laid out in this indictment. That one of the things that Pierre Thomas pointed out right away is that it's not just Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, the names that you've heard reported over and over again. Also central figures in this indictment, it would appear, and we'll let the Manhattan DA speak for himself, but it would appear David Pecker, who owned the National Enquirer, has played a significant role in this indictment put together by the DA and the allegation that there was this scheme, and we've reported on this before, to catch and kill stories that were considered to be harmful, if you will, to a presidential candidate, particularly some of these stories that were playing out in the months and leading up to that crucial election day of 2016, John.
Absolutely, and I have to come back to this motion about the trial date. January 16th is the New Hampshire primary. And the prosecution is asking for a start date in January for the trial. The Trump team responding with the spring. Well, the spring, we're talking Super Tuesday. We're talking the conclusion, or close to the conclusion, of the Republican primary process. No matter how you look at this, this plays out right in the middle of the campaign.
And it'll likely be pushed even beyond that. I mean, these are just the initial discussions about a trial date, and those things often get pushed back once motions start, et cetera. And again, as we talked about before, it's in the hands of the defendant, really, as to how much they want to delay it.
Yeah, we have all these protections for criminal defendants, and rightly so. So actually, prosecutors might want to move this along quickly, but it's not entirely in their control. So if the Trump team wants to delay it, you can't delay this forever like a civil case, but you have significant control over the timeline. And if they want to push it into the spring for whatever political reasons, I think that they're going to be able to do that to a degree, not indefinitely, but to a degree.
Well, we've been on the air now for several hours, and Kate, both you and Dan Abrams have pointed out repeatedly that the defense team will be in control of this timeline in large part. Let's listen to Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today. Earlier this afternoon, Donald Trump was arraigned on a New York Supreme Court indictment returned by a Manhattan grand jury on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. Under New York state law, it is a felony to falsify business records with intent to defraud and an intent to conceal another crime. That is exactly what this case is about. 34 false statements made to cover up other crimes. These are felony crimes in New York State, no matter who you are. We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct. The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records. He also caused others to make false statements. The defendant claimed that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. This simply was not true. And it was a false statement that the defendant made month after month in 2017. April, May, June, and so on through the rest of the year. For 9 straight months, the defendant held documents in his hand containing this key lie, that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. And he personally signed checks for payments to Michael Cohen for each of these 9 months. In total, the grand jury found there were 34 documents with this critical false statement. Why did Donald Trump repeatedly make these false statements? The evidence will show that he did so to cover up crimes relating to the 2016 election. Donald Trump, executives at the publishing company American Media Incorporated, Mr. Cohen, and others agreed in 2015 to a catch and kill scheme. That is, a scheme to buy and suppress negative information to help Mr. Trump's chance of winning the election. As part of this scheme, Donald Trump and others made 3 payments to people who claimed to have negative information about Mr. Trump. To make these payments, they set up shell companies, and they made yet more false statements, including, for example, in AMI, American Media Incorporated's business records. One of the 3 people that they paid to keep quiet was a woman named Stormy Daniels. Less than 2 weeks before the presidential election, Michael Cohen wired $130,000 to Stormy Daniels' lawyer. That payment was to hide damaging information from the voting public. The participant scheme was illegal. The scheme violated New York election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. The $130,000 wire payment exceeded the federal campaign contribution cap, and the false statements in AMI's books violated New York law. That is why Mr. Trump made false statements about his payments to Mr. Cohen. He could not simply say that the payments were a reimbursement for Mr. Cohen's payments to Stormy Daniels. To do so, to make that true statement, would have been to admit a crime. So instead, Mr. Trump said that he was paying Mr. Cohen for fictitious legal services in 2017 to cover up actual crime committed the prior year. And in order to get Michael Cohen his money back, they planned one last false statement. in order to complete the scheme, they plan to mischaracterize the repayments to Mr. Cohen as income to the New York State tax authorities. The conduct I just described and that which was charged by the grand jury is felony criminal conduct in New York State. True and accurate business records are important everywhere, to be sure. They are all the more important in Manhattan, the financial center of the world. That is why we have a history in the Manhattan DA's office of vigorously enforcing white-collar crime. My office, including the talented prosecutors you saw at arraignment earlier today, has charged hundreds of felony falsifying business records. This charge, it can be said, is the bread and butter of our white-collar work. And fraud presents itself in all different forms here in Manhattan. We have charged falsifying business records for those who violated federal bank secrecy laws. We have charged falsifying business records for those who were seeking to cover up sex crimes. And we have brought this charge for those who committed tax violations. At its core, this case today is one with allegations like so many of our white-collar cases. Allegations that someone lied again and again to protect their interests and evade the laws to which we are all held accountable. As this office has done time and time again, we today uphold our solemn responsibility to ensure that everyone stands equal before the law. No amount of money and no amount of power changes that enduring American principle. I'll now take questions.
Right. Excuse me, so we're going to take a limited number of for follow-up questions, one question per reporter. I will call on you, and again, we have limited time. Thank you. The first question will be Brett.
Thank you. Richard Russell, CNN. Why now? I mean, some argue that this is a political move. You're not going to be a political person. The birthdays are going to go into the next, political season. Why now?
We conducted a thorough and rigorous investigation, as we're known to do, at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I've been doing this for 24 years and am no stranger to rigorous, complex investigations. I bring cases when they're ready. Having now conducted a rigorous, thorough investigation, the case was ready to be brought, and it was brought.
Thank you. Mr. Bragg, the indictment says that there were 34 false business records. And they were done to conceal another crime, but the indictment does not specifically say what those crimes were. We are assuming, perhaps, that they might be election-related. I'm wondering if you can specify what laws were also broken.
Right. So let me say as an initial matter that the indictment doesn't specify that because the law does not so require. In my remarks, I mentioned a couple of laws, which I will highlight again now. The first is New York State election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. I further indicated a number of unlawful means, including more additional false statements, including statements that were planned to be made to tax authorities. I also noted the federal election law cap on contribution limits.
But why weren't there those crimes charged? Why wasn't he charged with those crimes?
Well, I'm not going to go into our deliberative process on what was brought. The charges that were brought were the ones that were brought. The evidence in the law is the basis for those decisions.
You had expressed a year ago that you had some reservations about the case's readiness. Can you talk to us about what were some of the questions in your mind that needed to be answered in order to bring a case of this magnitude?
I'm not going to go chapter and verse into any thinking. What I will say is, I believe the time period you're talking about, I'd been in office for a couple of months. The investigation, in my view, was not concluded into the conduct in particular that is the basis for the charges today. Since that time, we've had more evidence made available to the office and opportunity to meet with additional witnesses. So, as I said earlier, I've been doing this for 24 years. I don't bring cases prior to a thorough and rigorous investigation. Now, having done so, the case has been brought.
Yeah.
Brad Garrett, NBC News. Your predecessor took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Federal prosecutors took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Do you believe you have new evidence that led you to decide to charge this, or why not?
Well, as I just mentioned, we have had available to the office additional evidence that was not in the office's possession prior to my time here. And as to your part of your question about the federal, we have a distinct and strong, I would say profound, independent interest in New York State. This is the business capital of the world. We regularly do cases involving false business statements. The bedrock, in fact, the basis for business integrity and a well-functioning business marketplace is true and accurate record keeping. That's the charge that's brought here, falsifying New York State business records.
We're going to take a few more. Yep.
Thank you. DA Brad, I'm just going to read back one line from your statement of facts. The participants also took steps that mischaracterized for tax purposes the true nature of payments and furtherance of the scheme. Do you allege former President Trump was one of the participants who mischaracterized the payments for tax purposes?
I'm not going to go beyond the plain language statement of facts, which I think speaks for itself.
Brad, can you please comment on the strength of the evidence that Trump personally intended to violate state election law, including actions that are charged in the indictment?
So the charge is falsifying business records. The charge requires, as I specified, criminal conduct that was concealed. One of the concealed crimes we allege is New York State election law. I went through, and our statement of facts, which I think many of you have in front of you, goes through things including, text messages, emails, contemporaneous phone records, multiple witnesses. All of that will be, as you saw in the fall, borne out in a public courtroom in downtown Manhattan.
Last question is Jonah.
Yeah, Brad, the charges that were related to the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, the release from your office, also mentions another woman, Karen McDougal, as well as a doorman. Can you comment on how those players are related to the charges you've brought or to the case overall?
I'm glad you put your finger on that, because it's not just about one payment. It is 34 business records, 34 false statements in business records that were concealing criminal conduct. And the earlier question about New York State election law, when I talked about conspiracy to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. Those unlawful means, we allege, include the conduct set forth in the statement of facts, which is additional false statements separate and apart from the charged ones in AMI documents, planned false statements to taxing authorities. It is not just that one $130,000 wire payment. Thanks so much.
Can you comment about any incitement of violence by former president?
We'll see if he takes any more questions. He does not appear to be willing to. That's Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney today, who took the unprecedented step of criminally charging a president, former or current. This is the first time we've ever seen this in U.S. history. Obviously, you've heard that many times as we've reported on this, but it did play out this afternoon in Manhattan Criminal Court. Alvin Bragg pressed repeatedly, why now? Why these charges? He said he's been at this, a prosecutor in many different titles, capacities for 24 years, no stranger to cases that take a long time to bear out. He said, I bring them when they're ready. In breaking down why, there were 34 felony counts of falsifying business records and nothing in addition to that. He said that these are felonies and not just misdemeanors because they were meant to conceal other crimes. And he said there were two laws that I cited when pressed by reporters there. He said first was a New York State election law, which makes it a crime to have a falsified business record to help a candidacy. That would be to conceal the other crime, to help a candidacy by unlawful means. And he said, secondly, federal election law contribution limits, obviously those alleged payments out to Stormy Daniels, et cetera, the two other payments mentioned in this indictment, well above contribution limits at the federal level. He said these 34 falsified business records concealed other crimes, and that essentially it speaks for itself. Now, on the question of why now, because you've heard a lot of this, particularly from Republican supporters of Donald Trump, and it's a legitimate question to ask. Why now, as we now gear up for another presidential election? Alvin Bragg said, and I think this is key here, and whether it bears out, this is what we'll continue to press on as reporters here moving forward. But he said there is more evidence in hand now that he is the DA than what the previous Manhattan DA had in hand. Now, whether or not that's the David Pecker of this all, the owner of the National Enquirer, or it's another piece of crucial evidence here. Again, we're going to know that in the coming days and weeks. It would seem that David Pecker is playing a significant role in this indictment, this catch and kill scheme that is laid out in great detail, the alleged catch and kill scheme that Alvin Bragg says was concealed by falsifying these business records. So Dan Abrams, Kate Shaw, first I want to get your reaction from both of you. You said he would take questions, weren't sure if he would, hoped that he would. He did. Did he adequately answer the question of why now?
Well, if he can demonstrate that there was significant additional evidence that came forward that wasn't available before, that's certainly an argument to make. Now, it's interesting to think about the timing. David Pecker went into the grand jury after Robert Costello went into the grand jury. Remember, he was an attorney who had worked with Michael Cohen, who went in and blasted Michael Cohen. The Trump team had asked him to testify. He came in and said, Michael Cohen's not credible. Can't believe anything he says. David Pecker comes in after that point to testify, to effectively rebut Michael Cohen. Did they have David Pecker in their hands before that happened? Was this a new revelation to them after? Did they start having questions about the case? These are all things we don't know the answers to, but very important questions. So we'll see. It's still a little vague here as to exactly how they're going to enhance it from a misdemeanor to a felony. And that's the single most important question here. Because if this defense team is able to somehow get the felonies eliminated, if they're able to argue that they have not made a sufficient case to elevate it to a felony, you do then get into statute of limitations problems on a misdemeanor, which is only 2 years. And there are all sorts of rules and regulations around that. But the felonies are what give you 5 years. And there are extensions beyond that. But that's a very important legal argument that is still to come in this case. Still a lot we don't know.
Yeah, and this connection, Kate, the other part of the question, not simply just why now, but how do you make falsifying business records a felony? And he says it's clear in the indictment why we've done that.
Right, we've tied it, he says, to election integrity. This scheme, this conspiracy was about essentially inducing a fraud of some sort, right? Convincing the public to vote a particular way in a presidential election. I thought Bragg actually was quite effective here. I think he was kind of addressing critics who have said, this is kind of a small bore. This isn't as important. This is hush money payments. There are other investigations that are more significant. He really struck two notes. This is about financial integrity in the financial capital of the world and election integrity in the context of a presidential election. Those are high stakes matters, and that's what he said this case is about.
And again, he tried to make the case right there, and obviously he's going to do a much more extensive job of trying to make his case than just a couple of questions from the media there, that the falsification of business records concealed another crime, which was, in his words, he's alleging here the catch and kill scheme to protect a candidate, particularly in those final months leading up to the election. Pierre, you were talking about something else that struck a chord with you, and that's where the American people come into all this, the voters who were trying to make up their minds in an election where many believed they weren't happy with really either candidate.
I took particular note of what the district attorney said when he said, quote, this is about an effort to hide damaging information from the voting public. That's the heart of what this catch and kill scheme was about, according to the district attorney. And again, he's essentially saying that the campaign finance laws of this country, both state and federal, matter. And what the scheme was about was to create the aura that Donald Trump was a viable candidate who did not have this baggage. And the idea is that this baggage would have somehow damaged the campaign to the point where he might not have been able to win. And he's saying that Donald Trump was a direct participant with Michael Cohen and the publisher of the National Enquirer to get this done.
John Carl, what did you make of the case he made here?
Well, I think this is going to play out against a political background and a deeply divided country where a good chunk of our nation believes that this is entirely politically motivated. But, you know, he's made the case that this was an effort effectively to help his campaign and to hide the fact that it was done to help his campaign. I mean, it's going to be tough to make the case to that segment of this country, a big segment of the country, a segment not just hardcore Trump supporters, but perhaps some who don't support Trump, that this case is political.
And it's always important to remember, Terry Moran, that there were jurors before this grand jury who came up with allowing the DA to move forward with this indictment. And now there'll be jurors, if this goes to trial, who listen to this. And when you hear him describe this alleged catch and kill scheme, that's something that people can understand. It's not a leap to understand if you got something labeled one way and then you find out the money actually paid allegedly to catch and kill a story and to bury it. That would seem to be something, and we've reported on it often here, that people can at least understand. They can make their own judgment on the backside, but at least it's a scheme that it would seem they would be able to make the case and then let them decide whether or not it was a crime.
Oh, they'll understand it. I don't think there's any question about that, David, especially given the underlying tawdry facts. They'll lean in to the narrative and to the structure. The question is, can the DA prove that it is a violation of the law? And I think what we're about to embark on now is so critical in relation to what Jonathan Karl just said. Look, this is pouring gasoline on the raging fires of political polarization in this country. Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, has taken on a lot. And so how this case proceeds legally, how does he answer and get around the notion that statute of limitations has told under normal circumstances on these charges? He can. There are ways of doing it. But will that further fuel, a sense that this is a gotcha, go get 'em case, a fundamental violation of Americans' sense of fairness in how prosecution should proceed. And I do think that so much rests now on people seeing the rule of law at work. They'll have arguments at every stage. The jurors, as you point out, they'll understand the narrative, and they will have to weigh whether or not this rises to the level of criminal activity that Alvin Bragg has charged. In the John Edwards case, which, while not precisely on point, is similar, the jurors decided that what John Edwards did was wrong. There are a lot of wrong things you can do in an election. There are a lot of things you can try to keep from the voters to protect your position in an election that aren't criminal. And that will be the heart of this case.
Terry Moran, our thanks to you. With just a few moments left here, I want to get a few more opinions before we go off the air and push this forward to new reporting about what we can expect later tonight once the former president's back at Mar-a-Lago. But first to you, former Governor Chris Christie, former prosecutor as well. You heard Alvin Bragg. You were sitting here as part of this coverage with us. Listen, he said here that I take cases, I can bring them when they're ready. He also revealed that we had more in hand than the previous DA had. What did you make of that?
Well, on the first one, that's a standard prosecutorial line. They give that to you in the handbook when you get sworn in as a prosecutor. And so I was not surprised to hear him say that. And I don't think it has much import one way or another. On the fact that, on everything else he said, this better not be his best day. When you bring an indictment, you've got nobody pushing back against you. Nobody in the grand jury's pushing back against you. Defendants or witnesses are not allowed to have lawyers present. You get to present your case absolutely unobstructed. Well, that's not the way it's going to be from here forward. So the challenge for Bragg is going to be, this better not be his best day. He better have a lot of other really good days in the courtroom. And I think one thing we've got to look to is, what else does Pecker have beside just his conversations with Trump as alleged in the indictment? Does he have documents? Does he have emails or text messages which confirm certain things? Are there possibly tape recordings? I mean, all of those are things that may in fact exist. And so we've got to see what's the quality of the proof. But for Alvin Bragg today, he better hope today wasn't his best day. He better have a lot of good days going forward, because it will now be hotly contested in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion.
No question about that. Governor Christie, our thanks to you as always. Heidi Heitkamp, what did you make of what Alvin Bragg just laid out?
Well, I think he wanted to make the point that New York is the financial capital. We bring these cases all the time. To not bring against Donald Trump would not be consistent with what we think we need to do to protect business records. And so blah, 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 right? But the real challenge here for Donald Trump is what's next? What about the documents case in Mar-a-Lago? What about the special prosecutor? What about the case in Georgia? And so we're just one day into this on this case, but you've got to look at it kind of overall. We've been tracking a number of independents on social media in an organization that I head up, and I will tell you, looking at the indictment, since the indictment, there has been a lot of mega stories about this is horrible, it's all political. The independents are like, yeah, here we go again. With this guy, there's nothing but chaos, and we're tired of it. And so I think we've got to be a little careful because we're only one day into it. We're going to know more in a couple months on how politically people are going to react to this, and it's going to be in the context of additional investigations terminating.
There's no way. Thank you, Heidi. There's no way to escape that we're in the middle of a campaign season, the race for the White House underway again. President Biden has not declared that he's running again, but he said in an interview with me that he's every intention to do so. Respect her fate, but every intention to do so, and he's very much acting like the candidate out in the trail. And it was an interesting sort of split screen in the last 24 hours with him in Minneapolis talking about jobs at a manufacturing facility. Let's bring in Mary Bruce, because what was also key here, Mary, was the president addressed this for the first time, expressing his trust in the legal system and his trust in the NYPD. And they, of course, did do a good job today keeping the city and the former president safe, too.
And beyond that, David, this president really does not want to talk about this. He did weigh in briefly yesterday, as you noted, reinstating and reassuring everyone of his faith in the legal system, his faith in the NYPD to handle any unrest today. But Biden has not commented on the specifics of this, and he hasn't taken the opportunity to attack Trump in any way, which may at face value seem a bit unusual since Trump and Biden are likely, it seems, to go head-to-head in the next presidential race. But Biden, for one, is someone who takes very seriously the independence of the judiciary, but he also wants to draw a very clear contrast between the drama surrounding the former president and the work that the current president is doing. So this White House, instead of commenting, instead of going into a tit-for-tat with Donald Trump, is trying to project that Joe Biden is doing the work. They are trying to highlight his agenda this week, even though they know they certainly are going to have a very hard time getting that messaging through. For now, they are happy to have Donald Trump and the drama surrounding him soaking up much of the oxygen, David.
Mary Bruce live at the White House. Mary, thank you. And as we saw that image play out just moments ago, Donald Trump's plane taking off from LaGuardia, heading back to Mar-a-Lago, a couple of hours in the air before he lands there. I wanted to ask John Santucci, as we look at this image, John, we know that he has prepared a statement for tonight, that his team was helping him to work on this. The question is whether or not any of this will be revised, how harshly he'll go at the prosecutor in this case. That is not much of a question here, I don't think, among the team with me at the desk. How will he continue to go after the judge, and how careful he'll be with his message moving forward, or if this, in fact, becomes the message in his campaign?
Well, David, my understanding as of right now is that the former president is, as you say, on the plane. He is watching coverage. I'm told that they are going through the speech for tonight, making some tweaks, changing some language. Nothing to say that relates to any comments by the judge, but, Donald Trump is always working on whatever he is going to say, and sometimes, as we know, we'll ad-lib it in real time. Look, David, I've spoken to multiple people that have been around the former president in just the last couple of minutes here since leaving court and heading back to LaGuardia. Angry is one of the words I've gotten from several people. They are calming him down. He is calm. Resolute is another word that has been written to me by an aide. But the reality is right now, David, is that Donald Trump does need to take this seriously. And that is one thing that several advisors and allies of his are writing to me in real time, that just pause for a minute, and then calm down. Let's see what tonight brings.
John Santucci, thank you. And John Carl, really important night for him.
Yeah, and a very important statement that we've just gotten. This is from Mitt Romney, who is perhaps more than any prominent Republican other than Liz Cheney been a critic of Donald Trump, the only senator who has voted in 2 separate impeachment trials to convict Donald Trump, commenting on this by starting out by saying, "I believe President Trump's character and conduct make him unfit for office." That part's not a surprise. But then he says, even so, I believe the New York prosecutor has stretched to reach felony criminal charges in order to fit a political agenda. No one is above the law, not even former presidents, but everybody is entitled to equal treatment under the law. And he says that this prosecutor's overreach sets a dangerous precedent for criminalizing political differences. So that's from a prominent critic of Donald Trump saying that this case just doesn't sound right. I think you're going to hear more of that in the coming days.
Joining other Republicans who predicted this.
And perhaps some Democrats, too.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, John. And I wanted to, in closing here, do both ends of this journey. Aaron Katersky, who's at the courthouse, in a moment we'll go to Rachel Scott, who's standing by at Mar-a-Lago, because I think another important part of this story is that there had been significant concern on the part of law enforcement and authorities about the incitement of crowds. And I think that we can all, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but there is some relief that the calls for, protests that could get beyond what the authorities would want to see have not played out. And Aaron Katersky, perhaps you could speak to that here in New York, both at Trump Tower and down there at the courthouse. The NYPD, the Secret Service really deserves some credit here.
They do, David, and they were prepared for the worst. They heard the increasingly violent rhetoric coming from social media corners associated with the former president's indictment. They heard some of former President Trump's own hostile rhetoric on social media, and they were prepared for anything. And there are still some people shouting in the park right here across from the courthouse, but nothing like the large-scale protest that perhaps former President Trump had in mind ended up materializing either at Trump Tower, where there were mainly curious tourists, or down here at court. Finally, those either critics or supporters of the district attorney at least understand what it is that he's actually doing here. Prosecutors described, but did not charge, a conspiracy to violate both state election law and tax law when they say the former president allegedly falsified business records. And it was notable, I think, David, that in each of those charges, all 34 of them to which the former president pleaded not guilty, the prosecutor said he had intent to defraud. But the indictment does not specify who was defrauded, but an accompanying statement of facts does. It says that it's the 2016 voters in the presidential election, and any trial here, David, could fall in the middle of the 2024 presidential election. David.
Aaron Katersky at criminal court in Lower Manhattan. Aaron, thank you. And a quick point from Rachel Scott before we go, because Rachel, I know you're standing by. You're at the other end of this journey. We see the plane headed towards Florida to Mar-a-Lago. He expects to appear right in that room with you tonight before a group of supporters, a much different environment than what we watched transpire at criminal court today. And the question is, how far will he take it? Will he lean in? And does this essentially become his campaign now?
David, the lines now are certainly blurred. And when the former president touches down right here in Florida, the focus does turn to 2024. So much of the speech, so much of his remarks today were in flux, primarily because Trump had no idea what exactly he would be charged with. They are on the plane right now with his advisors. They're revising this speech, but they have been close on this all week, talking about ways to turn this into a political advantage. Bottom line, David, the tone has been set, and it is a tone of defiance. It was set when the former president called the central issue of our time the weaponization of the justice system. It was set when the former president said he would not step down or step aside from running for president in 2024 despite this indictment. In fact, he is fundraising off of it. The former president now not only the leading Republican candidate, but also a criminal defendant, David.
Rachel Scott in Mar-a-Lago tonight. Rachel, thank you. Our coverage is going to continue here, ABC News Live, abcnews.com. We're going to leave you here with the images of an extraordinary and history-making day. A day beginning, of course, with the former president leaving Trump Tower. There was that moment, very quick, but held his fist up to the crowd on his way to the courthouse. There he is, arriving in Lower Manhattan, sitting in court, pleading not guilty, in his own words, standing before the judge, 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Then, of course, boarding that plane that bears his name, making the journey home to Mar-a-Lago, where he will be before cameras, reporters again this evening, expected to give his reaction. And with him running for president and leading on the Republican side, many expect that he will lean in on this day. I'll be back with the entire team for World News Tonight. I'm David Muir in New York, and I really do thank you and the entire team here for their really careful and steady reporting. We'll continue to press all the questions on all sides of this. And I'll see you for World News a short time from now. Good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Okay, good. Thanks, Dante.
Yeah. So I really want to say that I'm so sorry that if I muddied up your relationship with Dante, because I'm so happy for you, Sam. I'm happy for you and for Dante, and that's what I wanted to say.